Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. One of the key concerns of Rene Descartes' meditations is being able to distinguish the true from the false. And these are terms that we use quite easily without sometimes understanding precisely what we mean when we say that something is false or that something is true. And in Meditation 3, this is going to play an important role and get some preliminary clarification on the part of Descartes. He's going to make some important distinctions about the ways in which something can be said to be false. Now, this is incredibly important because the entire Cartesian method of hyperbolic or methodological or metaphysical doubt, however you want to describe it, depended on treating things that are doubtful as if they are indeed false. So in what sense are those things false? About midway through the third meditation, Descartes talks about a distinction between being false in terms of true and formal falsity and material falsity. Now, he's using a rather scholastic terminology there, but I think you can see what he means quite easily when we look at what he says. So he says, as I remarked earlier, it's only in judgments that one can find true and formal falsity. And now that's kind of an interesting way to talk about it. True falsity. Falsity in the truest sense. Falsity, you could say, in its essential pattern or nature. And so he's saying this relies on us making judgments. And what is a judgment? A judgment is an affirmation or denial of something being the case. It has, you could say, a propositional content. It affirms or denies something of something, and it's an act that we engage in with our mind, whether we do so merely in thought or do so linguistically. It is a complex thing. So it is connecting up several different ideas and making some sort of affirmation or denial. That is where genuine falsity or formal falsity or true falsity resides for Descartes. Now, he talks then about a material falsity as well. And he says that we can still, nevertheless, find in ideas a certain material falsity. That is, when they represent what is not, or what is nothing, as if it was something. And here he's kind of speaking in shorthand. He talks about something that's nothing, rien, but we could also think of this as talking about something that is other, that is different, right? So when ideas represent things, for example, if I have an idea of a unicorn, and then I tack on, as some people have done, and I remember this from the 70s and 80s, they would add some Pegasus wings to it, and somebody would come along and say, that's not a real unicorn. Well, a unicorn isn't real anyway. There's a material falsity to unicorn, a horse with a horn on it, just as much as there is if you add some wings to it, right? And may as well, color them different colors and make them rainbow. We can imagine whatever we want when it comes to unicorns, right? But the idea doesn't represent the reality. And in that sense, you can say that it has a certain material falsity. There's a disconnect in what the idea is representing and whether there's any such thing like that in existence. Now, a little bit earlier, you notice Descartes here referred back to a distinction that he was making. This is earlier in the third meditation. He says that if we think about the thoughts that we have, right, and where we can find truth and falsity, he says that among my thoughts, some are like images of things. And those are the ones that we should properly call ideas, because they represent things like a human being or a chimera or the sky or an angel or even God. And then he says, of the others beyond this, they have different forms. For example, when I will or wish, when I fear, when I affirm and when I deny. I conceive, he says, something like the subject of the action of my mind. But I add also something by that action to the idea that I have of that thing. And of this genre of thoughts, he says, some of these are called volitions, willings, volontés, right? Or affections, meaning emotions, desires, all those sorts of affective states. And others are called judgments. So we have now three different types of thoughts. We have ideas, properly speaking, representing things. We have affections and volitions. And then we have the judgments that we just talked about. So he tells us, where are we going to find falsity in ideas? Now, we just talked about them not representing things accurately as they are, and in that we can talk about a certain material falsity. Considered solely as ideas, considered in themselves as images that are presented to us, there is no falsity to them. We are, in fact, truly experiencing them, whether it be through what we take to be sense perception or imagination, or even if, we're doing something intellectual with the understanding, that would be the case as well. So he says, so for what concerns ideas, if we consider them solely in themselves and we don't connect them to some other thing, they can't, properly speaking, be false. There is no falsity in them, except in this material sense of not corresponding to something else. Considered just as the ideas or images that we're being presented with, they're completely true. And it's also true to say, I have these ideas. I am experiencing these ideas. I am imagining this. What about our affections and volitions? Can we speak of them being true or false? Descartes says, yes, we can, and there's a long tradition going back quite a ways of saying maybe when it comes to emotions and choices or decisions, we can find some criteria by which to call them true or false in some practical sense, right? Descartes says we don't have to fear either that we would encounter falsity in affections or volitions. Why not? Why can't my volitions be false in the sense of being wrong, willing the wrong thing, right? He says, well, because even though I can desire bad things, or even what will never come to pass, nevertheless, it is for that no less true that I do in fact desire them. So if we're considering volitions, we're considering desires, we're considering emotional reactions as the ideas that we actually have within ourselves, there's nothing false about them. It's only insofar as we relate them somehow to something else. And this is why judgment is so absolutely central when it comes to falsity for Descartes. What goes on in a judgment? As I remarked earlier, judgments are composite. They involve affirming and denying, which, remember, were among the modes of thought that Descartes said, what am I? A thinking substance? I am a being that thinks. I am a being that imagines. I'm a being that wills. I'm also a being that affirms and denies. And affirming and denying is engaging in judgment. So he says, so all that remains are judgments in which I must take guard cautiously not to fool myself, because the principal error and the most common one that I'm going to encounter consists in that I judge that the ideas that I have in myself are resembling or in conformity, you could say corresponding to, the things that are outside of myself. That is the common judgment that I'm making all of the time. And that is a judgment. That's not simply registering something. That is the mind saying, I have this idea corresponds to something out there. I have an idea of a book. It's this book, right? This object that I'm perceiving. You're perceiving now as well as an idea. So he says, certainly, if I consider just the ideas like certain modes or fashions of my thought without wanting or choosing to connect them to something else that's exterior, then I have no occasion to go astray. I'm not affirming that they actually do correspond to things or denying that. So this is an important point. And what's going on metaphysically when there's falsity in our judgment, in our grasp on things, or even in the material falsity about the ideas not actually connecting up with the things that are. So he talks about ideas that represent things that are not. And here we might think about this in several different ways. Descartes is running through this rather summarily, but we should distinguish here several different ways in which we might have ideas of things that are not, right? One would be that we have an idea of something that simply is not the case at all, doesn't exist, period. So, again, the unicorn, or the square circle, absurdities, things along those lines. Then we might also have ideas about things that we represent to ourselves in ways that don't actually depict the thing that's out there. So, for example, when we are thinking about the human beings who we encounter, there is a possibility, Descartes considers, that maybe they're not genuinely human beings, but machines, that clothing is placed upon, and they're there to trick us or something like that. In that case, we would have an idea, and the idea would be in some way connected to a reality or an external thing, but the external thing and the idea don't actually map onto each other. Right? So we don't have a total lack of existence. We have a not existing in this way. And then he uses the example of heat and coldness. And he says, we take these for granted, but these are actually rather unclear and obscure ideas. And maybe they don't reflect anything genuinely out there. I mean, we nowadays think that it has to do with, the vibration of atoms, right? And how fast they're going, and we think about heat in that way. We think about radiant energy. But with Descartes, with what he's working with, he's saying, listen, the ideas that we actually have of heat and cold, we can have these ideas, but do they actually map onto anything? Perhaps not, because they're confused in themselves. So where do we get this falsity or confusion from? Here's where Descartes says something really quite interesting metaphysically, and it would be very easy for a reader to pass over this. This is something that is central to the Cartesian metaphysics. He says that they proceed or arise from nothingness. Neant is the word that he's using there. And what does that really mean? He says that they are in me, this is the formulation, because of a lack, un manque, or an imperfection within me. So the nothingness is not somewhere out there, right? The nothingness is actually within myself. There's some sort of privation or something that ought to be there that isn't there, or just doesn't happen to be there. And that's why we get things wrong when we get them wrong. Now that nothingness or privation generally is going to take the form of the judgments that we're making. And the last thing I'll say about this is Descartes thinks that we're making judgments much more often than we actually realize that we're doing. And part of the Cartesian meditations is to help us attend to those judgments that we are, in fact, making, so we can determine where falsity actually resides. The answer to that is, in its proper sense, in our judgments, not in the ideas themselves, not in the thoughts that we call affections or volitions, but in that species of thought that we call judgment that consists in affirming and denying.